Welcome to Fireside Story. In today's episode, we delve into a year that changed history, 1492, and the fall of Granada. On January 2nd of that year, a legendary city surrenders. The Alhambra, the jewel of Al-Andalus, changes hands after almost 800 years. The image of its last king handing over the keys is iconic. But was it a simple military conquest or the birth of an empire? We will see how the fall of the last Muslim kingdom not only redrew the map of Spain, it also financed the voyage that would change the world forever. A story much more complex than it seems. Let's get to today's chapter. To understand what happened in 1492, we first have to rewind the clock a bit. Forget the map of Spain, you know. If we travel to the Iberian Peninsula of the late 15th century, what we find is a puzzle of kingdoms with tense borders. Spain did not exist as a single country. The biggest and most powerful piece was the Crown of Castile. It was a demographic and military giant, the engine of the peninsula. Beside it, the Crown of Aragon, more focused on trade in the Mediterranean. These two kingdoms had just united, but not out of love, but for politics. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon was more a corporate merger than a fairy tale. Together they controlled most of the territory, but their power was not yet absolute. To the west, the Kingdom of Portugal looked toward the Atlantic, competing for new routes and riches. And to the south, wedged between mountains, the last Muslim bastion resisted. The Nasrid Emirate of Granada. It was a small territory of about 15,000 square kilometers. According to the estimates of the time, about 350,000 people lived there, clinging to their culture and their independence. This delicate balance of power was very fragile. For years, Castile had been distracted by a civil war. Isabella herself had to fight for her throne against Portuguese aspirations. Everything changed in 1479 with the signing of the Treaty of Alcazovas. This agreement put an end to the war and consolidated Isabella as the undisputed Queen of Castile. With their internal fronts secured and the union with Aragon underway, the Catholic monarchs could finally turn their heads and look, all at once, toward the south, toward Granada. Seen from the outside, the Emirate of Granada seemed like a paradise. Its walls protected a cultural and economic center full of life. The Alhambra was not just a fortress, it was the beating heart of a refined kingdom. Granadan silk was famous throughout Europe. Its agriculture, thanks to an advanced irrigation system, was incredibly productive. Furthermore, its port in Almeria was a key gateway for trade with North Africa. Granada was small, yes, but it was rich and sophisticated. But on the inside, the paradise was rotting. The politics of the Nasrid court was a good soap opera. It was full of betrayals and power struggles. And at the center of it all, a family willing to destroy itself for the throne. The conflict was a three-way struggle. On one side, there was the Sultan, Abu el-Hasan Ali. He was an older man, facing his own family. On the other side, there was his ambitious brother, Muhammad. He was better known as Zagal, which means the brave one. And to complicate things further, the Sultan's son appeared, the young Muhammad, whom history would remember as Boabdil. Supported by his mother and a faction of nobles, he rebelled against his own father. What could go wrong? This civil war was the perfect gift for Isabel and Fernando. It divided the Nasrid army and drained its resources. Each faction sought power for itself. They were not thinking about the enemy waiting on the other side of the border. While the Christian monarchs united their forces, those of Granada stabbed each other in the back. Sometimes literally. The greatest weakness of the last Muslim kingdom was not in its walls. It was inside its own palace. The border between Castile and Granada was not a calm line on a map. It was a scar that constantly suppurated. For years, life there was a cycle of low-intensity violence. Small raids, cattle rustling and kidnappings for ransom were an everyday occurrence. It was a dangerous business, yes, but a business nonetheless. Christian nobles and Nasrid commanders participated in this macabre game. A successful raid gave you booty, prestige, and kept your men busy. There was a sort of unwritten agreement. You strike, you withdraw, and you wait for the response. But on December 26, 1484, the Sultan of Granada decided to change the game. The attack on Zara de la Sierra was not just another raid. It was a statement of intent. His troops did not limit themselves to sacking the fortress. They annihilated the garrison and carried off the entire civilian population to be sold as slaves. It was an act of calculated brutality designed to impress his internal rivals. But he did not calculate the external reaction. He thought he was banging his fist on the table to scare Castile. What he actually did was give his enemies the reason they had been searching for years. For Isabella and Ferdinand, the news was a Christmas gift wrapped in the paper of war. They had long been waiting for the perfect excuse to launch the final conquest. They needed a cause that would unite their nobility and that the Pope could bless. The Zara massacre was just that. The propaganda machine was set in motion. One could no longer speak of border problems. Now it was a matter of honor, of faith, and of revenge. The attack was presented as the definitive proof that coexistence was impossible. The spark had been ignited. The Sultan, trying to put out fires in his own palace, had just set his entire kingdom on fire. The era of skirmishes was over. What came next was total war. A crusade with a single objective, the unconditional surrender of Granada. The affront of Zara was not a matter of state. It was personal, especially for the Andalusian nobles who lived on the frontier, for whom honor was as important as land. And no one took it more to heart than Rodrigo Ponce de Leon, the Marquis of Condés. He was not going to wait for orders from the court. He wanted revenge. His target was a dagger aimed at the heart of Granada, the city of Alhama, rich, well defended, and a few kilometers from the Nasrid capital. Taking it was not just about returning the blow. It was about ripping their hearts from their chests so they could see them beat in his hand. A declaration that the game of skirmishes was over. On the night of February 28, 1482, the cold and stealth were his best weapons. His men, using scaling ladders, climbed the walls of the citadel in the most absolute silence. The Nasrid sentinels, confident in the supposed peace, did not see the blow coming. When the first alarm sounded, it was already too late. Chaos took over the streets, and at dawn, the flag of Castile was flying over the fortress. The news struck the Alhambra like a lightning bolt. The famous ballad that immortalized the moment tells the story better than any chronicle. It describes a Moorish king walking through his city when he receives the letters with the news. His first reaction is one of fury. He kills the messenger and throws the letters into the fire, as if by burning the paper he could erase reality. But the most revealing part of the poem is not the lament. It is the accusation. In the ballad, a wise old man, an alfaquin, dares to tell the king to his face that the fault is his. He reminds him of the injustices and the internal purges that had weakened the kingdom. He tells him to his face, "You killed the Bensarajas, who were the flower of Granada." The refrain, "Woe to my Alhama," was much more than a lament. It was the recognition of a fatal mistake. The loss of Alhama was the first nail in the kingdom's coffin, a mortal wound from which Granada would never recover. The war was no longer on the frontier. It was in the living room. The fall of Alhama left Sultan Abu al-Hassan in a very weak position. For his son Boabdil who was still in open rebellion. This was a golden opportunity. He needed a victory of his own to prove that he was the true leader that Granada needed. A masterstroke that would legitimize him. So, blinded by ambition, Boabdil gathered his men and launched an attack. His objective, the Christian city of Lucena. It was an impulsive, poorly planned, and, above all, incredibly arrogant decision. He believed that a quick victory would give him the prestige he so craved. The result was an absolute disaster. On April 21st, 1483, his army was ambushed and annihilated in the Battle of Lucena. The Castilian troops, led by Diego Fernández de Córdoba, not only crushed his army, they did something much more important. They captured Boabdil himself. The news was a bombshell and raised a vital question. What do you do when you capture the enemy king? The normal thing would be to demand a huge ransom or execute him to demoralize the adversary. But Isabel and Fernando were not normal. They were much smarter. They saw an opportunity that no one else had considered. They decided to release him. But with conditions, of course. Boabdil had to sign a humiliating pact. He became a vassal of the Catholic monarchs. In exchange for his freedom and Christian military aid, he pledged to continue the civil war against his father and his uncle. It was a political masterstroke. They no longer needed to conquer Granada by force alone. Now they had the Nasrid king himself working for them from the inside. Boabdil returned to his kingdom, but not as a hero. He returned as a puppet. Granada's most dangerous enemy was no longer on the frontier. He was sitting on its own throne. With Boabdil back in Granada, acting as a puppet king, the war entered a new phase. If you are expecting great battles in the open field with cavalry charges and epic duels, you are in for a disappointment. The Granada War was, above all, a war of patience and demolition, one siege after another. The strategy of the Catholic monarchs was as simple as it was brutal. It was known as the slash and burn. Before attacking a city, the Christian army would ravage the surrounding farmlands. They burned crops, cut down olive trees, and destroyed irrigation systems. The objective was to strangle the enemy economically, to leave them without food and without resources before the first cannonball struck their walls. And strike they did. The great technological advantage of the Christians was their artillery. Isabella and Ferdinand invested a fortune in bringing the best pieces of the era from France and Burgundy. Enormous bronze cannons, called lombards, that could fire stone projectiles weighing up to 150 kilos. The sound of these weapons was terrifying, a roar that shook the earth and the souls of the defenders. The medieval walls of the Nasrid cities, designed to withstand swords and arrows, were not prepared for this. They crumbled as if they were made of sand. The result was a domino effect. One by one, the fortresses that protected the heart of the kingdom began to fall. In 1485, the impregnable city of Ronda surrendered after a devastating bombardment. The following year, in 1486, Loja fell, one of the keys to the Vega of Granada. Moving this modern army and its heavy artillery through the mountainous terrain of Granada was an unprecedented logistical effort. Roads were built, supply lines were organized, and thousands of men and animals were mobilized. It was a slow but unstoppable war machine. With each conquered city, the siege on the capital tightened. Granada was being dismembered, piece by piece. Its natural walls, the fortress cities that protected it, were disappearing under the power of gunpowder. The path to the Alhambra was being cleared. After the fall of Loja, the Castilian war machine set its next objective. It was not just any city. It was Málaga, the most important port of the Emirate. Its connection with North Africa, the gateway for reinforcements and supplies. If Málaga fell, Granada would be strangled. The siege began on May 7, 1487. Ferdinand of Aragon himself took command of the operations. But the people of Malaga were not like the others. At the head of their defense was Hamet el-Zegri, a veteran commander and fiercely loyal to the Nasrid cause. A tough guy of the old school. Under his command, the city prepared for a resistance to the death. The bombardment by the Christian artillery was incessant, day and night. But the walls held, and the defenders repelled every assault. Weeks passed, and then months. Inside the city, the situation was desperate. Hunger began to bite hard. They ate the horses, the cats, and even the rats. The civilian population, exhausted and starving, begged El-Zegri to negotiate a surrender. But he refused. Finally, without food and without hope, the city surrendered on August 18. The survivors expected clemency, but they did not find it. Isabella and Ferdinand, enraged by the stubborn resistance, decided to make a terrifying example. Almost the entire population, between 15,000 and 20,000 people, was enslaved. It was one of the largest enslavement operations of the entire century. The punishment was not a whim. It was a calculated lesson in terror. The message for the rest of the cities that still resisted was clear. If you surrender quickly, perhaps there will be mercy. If you fight to the end, this is your fate. The fall of Malaga was a mortal blow. Granada had lost its access to the sea. It was completely isolated from the world. The noose around its neck had tightened a little more. With Malaga annihilated, the attention of the Catholic monarchs focused on the last great obstacle. It was not Boabdil who continued playing at being king in Granada. The real problem was his uncle, Zagal, the Brave. He controlled the eastern part of the kingdom and was the last leader who offered a real and organized resistance. The objective was clear: Baza, the capital of Zagal's domains. The siege began in June 1489, and from the beginning, it was a real headache for the Christians. The city was well defended, the terrain was difficult, and the morale of the Castilian army began to plummet. The months passed, the cold arrived, and the soldiers began to think that it would never end. It was then that Queen Isabel made one of her most famous moves. She appeared in person at the military camp. It was not a simple visit. She arrived with reinforcements, money, and a steely determination that spread to the entire army. That was not a suggestion. It was an order: this city falls. The effect was immediate. Morale skyrocketed and the siege intensified. Finally, after 6 long and exhausting months, Baza surrendered in December. Zagal, who was brave but not stupid, saw that the game was over. He met with the monarchs and made them an offer they could not refuse. He sold them everything he had left, including the cities of Almeria and Guadix, in exchange for a good sum of money and a golden exile in North Africa. It was the end of the last great Nasrid warrior. And meanwhile, what was Boabdil doing in the Alhambra? Seeing his uncle out of the picture, he felt like the only rooster in the henhouse. In an act of audacity or complete madness, he broke his pact of vassalage with Castile and proclaimed himself the sole lord of Granada. The problem was that his kingdom was now only the city and little else. He was completely alone, surrounded by an enemy he had just betrayed. The stage for the final act was set. A small aside: if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. Boabdil's bravado did not last long. By breaking his pact and proclaiming himself the sole lord of Granada, what he achieved was to paint a giant target on the Alhambra. The response from Isabella and Ferdinand was not an angry letter. It was an army. In April 1491, the Serpent began to coil. A formidable army, which the chroniclers of the time estimated nearly 50,000 men, appeared on the plain of Granada. It was a city of steel in motion, with thousands of soldiers, heavy cavalry, and the feared artillery. The siege closed completely. Every road, every path, every possible supply route was cut off. The city was sealed, like a tomb. No one entered or left. The Serpent's embrace was total. Inside the walls, the situation was chaos. Granada was no longer a city. It was an overpopulated last refuge. It was home to its inhabitants and to thousands of refugees who had fled from the conquered cities. Every mouth was a countdown to disaster. Ferdinand and Isabella were in no hurry. They did not need to risk their men in a direct assault on the Alhambra. They knew that the most powerful fortress in the world is useless if its defenders starve to death. The strategy was not gunpowder, but the calendar. They were going to make the city surrender through exhaustion. Every dawn, the Granadans saw the same desperate landscape. A ring of steel that tightened a little more. The embrace was slow, silent, but deadly. The city's resistance had become a simple matter of time. Christian camp was a sea of canvas and wooden tents. A temporary city for a siege that they hoped would not last too long. But in July 1491, a careless act changed everything. A tipped-over candle in Queen Isabella's tent unleashed a fire that ravaged a large part of the camp. For many here, that would have been a terrible sign, an omen to abandon the campaign before the arrival of winter. But Isabella of Castile was not like the others. She saw the ashes, and instead of hesitating, made a decision that would go down in history. They were not going to rebuild a temporary camp. They were going to build a real city, a city of stone and brick at the gates of Granada. The message for Boabdil and his people was brutally clear. We are not leaving. It doesn't matter if it takes us months or years. We are staying here until you surrender. They called it Santa Fe. In just 80 days, what seemed like madness became a reality. Thousands of workers erected a city with a symbolic and military design. Its layout was in the shape of a Latin cross, like a Roman camp, with 4 monumental gates. It was a permanent fortress, a declaration of intent made of mortar. Put yourself in the shoes of an inhabitant of Granada. You have been trapped for months. Hunger is tightening its grip, and hope is fading. And then you look over the wall. You no longer see a camp that could disappear with the first snowfall. You see the roofs and towers of a new city, an enemy city that has come to stay. The psychological blow was devastating. Santa Fe was more effective than any cannon. It demonstrated that the will of the monarchs was unbreakable. Resistance no longer made sense. Now the only question was not if Granada would fall, but when they would begin to negotiate the surrender. The construction of Santa Fe was a nail in the coffin of the Granadan resistance. Inside the walls, hunger was no longer a threat. It was a reality that gnawed at stomachs and morale. Diseases spread through the streets crowded with refugees. The city was a pressure cooker. There were nobles who preferred to die fighting, but there were also many who perfectly remembered the fate of Málaga. Was it worth turning Granada into another massacre? At the center of this dilemma was Boabdil. His bravado had vanished. Now only a trapped king remained, responsible for the lives of thousands of people. It was his vizier, Abu al-Qasim al-Muli, a pragmatic politician, who made him see the harsh truth. The game was lost. The only thing they could do was negotiate a dignified exit. Thus, the contacts began. At night, in secret, emissaries slipped out of the city to meet with the representatives of the Catholic monarchs. The Christian negotiating team was top-notch. There was Hernando de Zafra, the Queen's astute secretary, a relentless bureaucrat, and at his side a young captain who was beginning to make a name for himself, Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba. The talks were a tense game of chess. The Granadans asked for respect for their lives, their faith, and their properties. The Christians, for their part, wanted one thing above all else: the keys to the Alhambra, and they were not willing to wait long. For Boabdil, each day was a torture. To surrender meant going down in history as the king who handed over the last Muslim kingdom. To fight to the end meant condemning his people to a horrible death. There was no good option, only one less terrible than the other. Finally, seeing the hungry faces of his people, he made the only possible decision. The swords were sheathed. Now, the fate of Granada would be decided with ink and paper. The drafting of the document that would put an end to almost 800 years of history began. On November 25, 1494, the war stopped to make way for diplomacy. The document that would change everything was signed. It was not a simple note of surrender. It was the capitulations of Granada, a very detailed legal contract with 77 clauses. Read on paper, the agreement seemed incredibly generous. The main promise was religious freedom. No one would be forced to convert to Christianity. The mosques would remain open, and their rights would be respected. The sound of the call to prayer would continue to be heard in the city. But there was much more. The right to private property was guaranteed. Muslims could keep their houses, their lands, and their goods. If anyone decided to leave for North Africa, they could sell their properties and take their fortune with them. And perhaps most surprisingly, they would continue to be governed by their own laws. Their own judges, the Qadis, would continue to administer justice according to their customs. In practice, they were promised almost total autonomy within the Kingdom of Castile. Of course, all of this came at a price. In exchange for these promises, Boabdil committed to surrendering the entire city. The Alhambra and the main fortresses would pass into Castilian hands within a maximum of 60 days. Seen this way, one might think that Isabella and Ferdinand were champions of tolerance. The reality was much more pragmatic. Offering these terms was the fastest and cheapest way to avoid a final assault. An assault that, even if they won, would cost thousands of lives and a lot of money. The ink dried on the parchment. The fate of Granada was no longer in the hands of the soldiers. It was sealed in a document that seemed to protect the vanquished. Now, all that remained was to wait for the appointed day for the handover. Paper can hold anything, but the patience of a hungry and frightened people has a limit. The surrender agreement had been signed in secret. Boabdil knew that if the news leaked out ahead of time, the most radical elements could start a suicidal revolt. They had to act fast. The handover, scheduled for later, was moved up. The chosen date was January 2nd, 1492. Before any ceremony, a practical decision was made. In the cold, early morning of that day, a small group of Christian knights stealthily entered Granada. Their mission was to take control of the Alhambra and the main towers, to avoid any last-minute surprises. Shortly after, with the fortress already secured, Boabdil left the city to meet with the monarchs. The meeting took place near the Genil River. The chronicles describe a solemn scene without unnecessary humiliations. The Nasrid king, on horseback, made the gesture of kissing Ferdinand's hand. He handed him the keys to the city. It is said that his words were, "Take, my lord, the keys to your city, for I and those within are yours." Ferdinand, in a gesture of respect, did not let him kiss his hand and took the keys. Immediately after, he handed them to Queen Isabella. The symbolic message was clear. This was a victory for both of them. While this was happening, All eyes turned to the top of the Alhambra. On the Torre de la Vela, the highest in the citadel, 3 standards were raised. They were the banner of Castile, that of Aragon, and above them all, a large silver cross. The Christian army, watching the scene from the plain, erupted in jubilation. The bells of the improvised city of Santa Fe rang out loudly. The soldiers knelt and chanted the Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving. Granada had fallen. The Reconquista, that very long process of almost 8 centuries, had officially ended. For the victors, it was the beginning of an empire. For Boabdil, it was the beginning of exile. After the handing over of the keys, Boabdil and his entourage began the journey into exile. A golden exile, to be sure. The capitulations had granted him a lordship in the Alpujarras, a small mountain kingdom, as a consolation prize. It is on this journey that one of the most famous legends in the history of Spain is born. The story goes that, upon reaching a hill, Boabdil stopped his horse. He turned to contemplate for the last time the red towers of the Alhambra and broke into tears. It was then that his mother, the Sultana Ixa, approached and told him that lapidary phrase, "Weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." A textbook historic burn. The place, since then, has been known as the Moor's Sigh. It sounds very poetic, doesn't it? Perhaps too much so. Because when historians look for this scene in the chronicles of the time, they find it nowhere. Not a trace of the tears, nor of the sigh, nor of Mom's harsh reprimand. The anecdote first appears decades later. It was written by a bishop named Antonio de Guevara. He was a character known for his tendency to invent speeches to make his accounts more juicy. He was the Hollywood screenwriter of the 16th century. The legend took hold because it was perfect. It built the image of a weak, soft, and wretched Boabdil. A king who lost his kingdom not because of the enemy's strength, but because of his own incompetence. It made the Christian victory even more glorious and justified. The reality, as always, is more complex. Boabdil was a king trapped in a civil war and facing a military superpower. Perhaps he was not a great hero, but the story that has come down to us is a caricature written by his conquerors. Boabdil's small kingdom in the Alpujarras was a gilded cage. He had lands, servants, and money. But he had lost the most important thing, sovereignty. Living as a vassal of the kings who had taken the Alhambra from him was a daily humiliation. His presence on the peninsula was also a political problem. For many of his former subjects, he was still a symbol. He was a king in exile. This situation was uncomfortable for the crown and dangerous for Boabdil himself. He could not adapt. The pressure was constant, and the nostalgia unbearable. So he made the only decision he had left. Less than 2 years after the surrender, he reached an agreement with the Catholic monarchs. He sold them all the properties they had granted him and prepared for his definitive departure. In October 1493, the last king of Granada said farewell forever. Boabdil and his family embarked from the port of Adra, in Almeria. His destination was the kingdom of Fez, in Morocco. This time there was no turning back. His life after this is lost between history and legend. He settled in Fez, where he was welcomed by the Sultan. Some sources say he died an old man, living on memories. Other, more novelistic versions claim that he died in battle. They say that he fought for the Sultan of Fez. He sought in combat the heroic end he did not have in Granada. What is the truth? Perhaps we will never know. The only certain thing is that the last member of the Nasrid dynasty ended his days far from his red palace. He became a ghost. He was a footnote in the history of an empire that was being born while his own faded away forever. The Granada War had been a monumental economic drain. For a decade, every soldier and every cannon represented an immense cost for the crown, reaching astronomical figures for the time. Now, with the Alhambra in their possession, the monarchs had a new and much more pleasant problem. They had to decide how to invest the resources that the war no longer consumed. While the nobles planned how to divide up the new lands, a man had been waiting for his moment for years. He was an insistent Genoese navigator with an idea that seemed like madness to many. His name was Christopher Columbus. He had been at the camp of Santa Fe, watching the city fall. He had presented his project to sail westward several times, but he had always been told no. The war was the absolute priority, but the victory of 1492 changed everything. Suddenly, the kingdom's attention and money were available for new ventures. Columbus's proposal no longer seemed so far-fetched, but rather a way to compete with Portugal on the spice route. The connection is direct and swift. Barely 3 months after seeing the crosswave over the Alhambra, the definitive agreement was signed. On April 17, 1492, in the same city of Santa Fe, the capitulations were signed. This document authorized and financed the voyage that would change the map of the world forever. The end of the Reconquista was not just the end of an era. It was the starting shot for the construction of a global empire, paid for, in part with the echo of the victory in Granada. The generous conditions signed in the capitulations seemed at first a real promise. The first Archbishop of Granada, Fray Hernando de Talavera, was a man of dialogue. He learned Arabic and preached by example. He tried to attract Muslims to Christianity through persuasion and respect. It was an approach that today we would call winning hearts and minds. But patience was not a widespread virtue in the court. Soon, a man with much less finesse arrived in Granada, Cardinal Cisneros. He was Queen Isabel's confessor and a supporter of the hard line. For Cisneros, Talavera's persuasion was a simple waste of time. He believed that conversion should be massive, and above all, very rapid. The turning point came in 1499. Cisneros ordered a public burning of books in the Plaza de Bibramla. Thousands of Nasrid manuscripts burned in a monumental bonfire. They were works of theology, science, philosophy, and poetry. Only a few medical texts were saved. It was an act of tremendous cultural arrogance. The message was clear: their world had to disappear. The response was as predictable as it was explosive. The forced conversions and the book burning lit the fuse. Thus, the first rebellion of the Alpujarras broke out. Between 1499 and 1501, the mountains became the stage for a guerrilla war. It was a desperate and brutal struggle on the part of the Muslims who felt betrayed. For the monarchs, this rebellion was the perfect pretext they had been waiting for. They argued that the Muslims had broken their part of the deal by taking up arms. Therefore, the capitulations were annulled. It was the legal justification they needed to do away with everything they had promised. In 1502, the Pragmatic of Forced Conversion was issued. The choice for all the Muslims of Castile was now brutally simple. They either accepted baptism or had to go into exile. The paper that promised tolerance had turned to ash, like the books of Bib Ramla. The year of 1492 did not end with the handing over of the keys. The fall of Granada was only the first act of a much deeper transformation. It was the moment when the Catholic monarchs, at last, could look up from the battlefield and begin to build their true project of a kingdom. A kingdom with a single power, a single territory, and above all, a single faith. With the war over, the energy dedicated to the conquest was redirected inward. The objective was no longer to defeat an external enemy. It was to mold the internal society in the image and likeness of its new rulers. The religious diversity, which had characterized the peninsula for centuries, had its days numbered. The next step was taken shortly after. From the very palace of the Alhambra that they had just conquered, Isabella and Ferdinand signed an edict. This document was not aimed at the vanquished Muslims. It was aimed at the other great minority of their kingdoms, the Jewish community. The order was as simple as it was brutal. They had to choose between baptism or exile. There was no third option. The victory over Islam in the south gave way to the expulsion of Judaism throughout the territory. Thus, that year became the foundational moment of a new Spain. The conquest of Granada closed a chapter of almost 8 centuries of history. The expulsion of the Jews closed the door on a model of medieval coexistence, imperfect and often violent, but diverse. The legacy of those months is therefore a two-sided coin. On one side, the unification that laid the foundations for a global empire. On the other, the birth of an intolerant state that sought cohesion through exclusion. Granada was not just the end of the Reconquista. It was the beginning of a new way of understanding power, faith, and identity, a way whose consequences resonate to this day. And so we come to the end of our journey to 1492. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of the capture of Granada. We hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoyed our work, the best way to support us is by subscribing to the channel. Also, activate notifications so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries. Leave us a comment telling us what you thought, and tell us what other great story you would like us to explore together. We'll see you very soon by the fireside.